As I'm sure you're aware, I don't really talk that much about video games on the channel. I do have a video game related video essay coming soon, but I wanted to release this one first because I really want to talk about this game in full detail, full spoilers, because it's the sequel to one of my all-time favorites and perhaps the objective, or at the very least, most universally agreed on best game of the PS3/PS4 generation. I played the first game on the PS4, that's why I'm saying that. But obviously, The Last of Us Part 2 has been met with a very mixed response. The leaks haven't helped one bit, and I thought I'd talk about that first. How this video will work is that I'll break it down into 4 chapters. First, I'll address the leaks and the controversy from my point of view. Then we'll go through the gameplay, the technical aspects, then the story, and then the characters. That'll be the big portion, and then just some final thoughts. And I cannot stress this enough. Almost everything I say is purely my personal opinion, and I will try to go about expressing that in the most civilized and calm way possible. So without further ado, let us dive into the crazy game that is The Last of Us Part 2. By the way, the first chunk is spoiler free, so you can keep watching if you want for a little bit. So I think it's fair to say that The Last of Us Part 2 will go down in history as one of the most divisive games ever made. Just like The Last Jedi is one of the most divisive modern films, and Game of Thrones Season 8, is the same for TV. I've made my displeasure towards Season 8 very clear and very public, but I've also said that there are a lot of good things about that, but that ultimately there are more cons than pros. On the other hand, I've also talked about my feelings towards The Last Jedi, and how I do quite like the film. I think it has some very obvious story and character problems, along with a really messy tone, and I think that's kind of indisputable at this point. But the filmmaking, I think, is really good, and ultimately, in my opinion, there are just very, very slightly more pros than cons. I won't deny, though, that it kind of broke Star Wars in half. The Last of Us Part 2 for me is kind of like that. I completely understand the issues that so many have with the game, and I myself share some of those issues as well, but I think it's important to acknowledge that there is so much good stuff on display here as well, and to see the whole picture I think is very important. And unfortunately, this is something that a lot of people aren't seem to be doing, because essentially, I think that the response to The Last of Us Part 2 can really be broken down into 3 groups. There are people who absolutely love it with all their heart, proclaiming it to be a daring and bold masterpiece, and kind of saying that anyone who doesn't like this game is a racist, sexist, homophobe, transphobe, bigot, hacker, and then they're trying to cancel that other side on social media, even though most of the criticisms are to do with story and characters and themes, and most of them are actually quite valid. And then on the other side, there are the people labeling this like the biggest disappointment in gaming history, saying it's unplayable, and not only is it a terrible game, but that it murders the legacy of the predecessor. And the funny thing is, some of these people are saying this even though they've actually declared online that they have not and will not play the game. Now, I'm not going to call these people idiots, because I think it's fair that you don't need to have eaten shit to know that no one wants to eat shit and it doesn't taste nice, and I'm sure those people are operating from that mentality. Now, I would want to say to those people that if you played the first game and you loved it, don't give up so easily on the second. Don't jump to conclusions and throw it under the bus so quickly. This situation of people being so excited for the first game and then just completely boycotting it based on leaks and bad reviews and fake news or whatever, which, by the way, this is not a spoiler because the leaks were incorrect about Abby, but she's not a trans character. She's a straight up woman. Like, at no point in the story is it ever stated or even suggested that she had a penis in between her legs at one point in her life. She just looks really masculine, and I get that, fair enough. She looks more masculine than most men. She looks more masculine than me, that's for sure. But no, she is a female through and through. Right, in a biological sense. So that part of the leaks is utter bollocks, and I'm sorry to say those memes, unfortunately, will not age well once people actually realize that. There is a trans character, but it's a side character who only becomes prominent in the second half, although I don't really know why people are making such a big deal out of this. Ellie is a homosexual character, and if you're worried about the game being overly politicized and prioritizing the identity politics over the story and the characters, that's not the case at all. Like, at all. And when it is, when there is that aspect of the game, I think it's woven into the story quite nicely. And trust me, no one dislikes unnecessarily woke content than me. So please do trust me when I say that, that part of the game, it's just not the case. I would not describe this game as woke at all, and my issues do not lie in that department. So yeah, as I was saying, this whole mob mentality of people loving the first game and then being so excited for the second game and then forsaking the game because of a few pieces of uncontextualized information, or even if they've just read the plot outline or jumped to the end on walkthroughs, and now they say it's terrible without playing it, sort of reminds me of this one line that Ryan Gosling says in La La Land.
They worship everything and they value nothing.
Now, I personally feel that if you have the money, and I mean you definitely have the time, give it a chance. If you like it, then great. But if it disappoints you, then disregard it as a sequel and wait a few weeks for Ghost of Tsushima. And then you can say I played The Last of Us 2 and I didn't like it because. Then you sound a lot less crazy and unreasonable than saying The Last of Us 2 is terrible and I didn't even play it. Then there's the third group of people who I think acknowledge the pros and cons and are approaching things, I think, from a less heated place. And I'd like to think I'm one of them. I'm trying to be one of them. Quite a few reviewers on YouTube I've seen have sort of expressed their praise or their displeasure in this way, which I think is a nicer way of talking about this kind of stuff, and it's how I'd like to proceed. Now, full spoilers, so for anyone who doesn't want to get the game spoiled for them, I think it's good. I think you should play it. I think it's definitely quite an experience, whether or not you come out loving or hating it. I think you'll still remember it, and it is quite the experience. So spoilers from here on out, but I'll also be inserting some clips of my recorded voiceover reactions to some of the stuff that happens during the recorded gameplay. I think there's a bit of a disconnect between the technical aspects and the actual gameplay for me, because The Last of Us 2 is technically brilliant. I only walked through other characters once or twice. I didn't experience any serious glitches that made me have to redo entire sections again. The music is really good, and to emphasize the guitar as the primary instrument used in the composing of the score, as it was in the first game, I think is absolutely great. Not only does it set these games apart from other zombie material, the style of music and visuals creates this almost old school Western feel, which I always really like. And it obviously complements the actual object of the guitar as one of the primary motifs in the game itself. I just wish we had more music. I don't think they capitalized on it as much as they could have, especially when the music that was there was so good. The visuals are also quite stunning. The game looks very nice, and the lighting and the shadows and all that are very well done. The motion capture work and the details on the humans are just breathtaking. And it kind of goes without saying at this point that the performances were terrific, and some of the best ever. Although I will say that I still think Red Dead 2 is the visually prettiest game I've ever played, but this one is still great, right up there with Red Dead 2. Especially now the sequence on the Seraphites Island, where everything is on fire, and also that rainy, flame-lit night chase that was briefly shown in one of the cinematic trailers. And that brings me to my next point, which is the game has a very cinematic quality, right? More so than most AAA video games of its generation, I think. If we were to judge it as a film, the cinematography is very impressive. This here is probably my favorite shot from a compositional point of view. It just has a very striking simplicity that I love in my films. The relationship between the opening and the closing shots I think was pretty perfect. A similar image, but completely different emotions tied to them. I also had this to say about the final shot. Oh, I am liking this final shot. Brilliant, brilliant dollying from a wide into a close-up. If they have Ellie walk out in the background, have Ellie walk out in the background, the guitar in the foreground. Guitar in the foreground, Ellie in the background. Please, please, yep, there she is, Brilliant, brilliant, the composition, cut to black, cut. I also want to touch on how the cutscenes are done, which I really admire. Both the action and the dialogue aspects are primarily shown through long takes, and I have to bring attention to the filmmaking in the scene, which I think is truly effective. This lovely long take, which, feels like this sort of building tension stage play almost, shot by Emmanuel Lubezki, and it's contrasted with this sort of Darren Aronofsky style cuts and shifts in perspective in this part of it, and I love that. The actual gameplay, on the other hand, felt a bit too samey. Bang, 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 you're dead. You're fucking happy. Pow.
Stop fucking with the gun.
There's been a significant gap, right, between these two games, with Uncharted 4 coming out in between. And yet it feels like very little has changed in that department. The level design is very good, and I think it challenges you appropriately. In other words, they misdirect you and you get lost just the right amount. Ellie and Abby's movement and navigation are a bit smoother than Joel's in the first game. The prone and the jump obviously help, but I think the combat and the stealth and the traversal can feel a bit repetitive sometimes, especially since the game is so long, and that's something I'll expand on in just a bit. I will say though that the good thing about the action being simple enough is that you're familiarized with it and you feel like you're actually quite good within the world of the game pretty quickly.
What the fuck is this? Eat it. Don't just stare at it. Eat it. Let's go.
After a while, it starts to feel like second nature, and you can then feel more competent as that particular character, especially during the boss fights, of which there are some pretty good ones, I think.
What the fuck is this now?
Oh, I smell a horde of zombies coming, or a big boss guy. Show it, go on. Go on, Sean. Go on, Sean.
Oh my god, what the fuck? Shit, the fuck is that?
Drive the car. Drive the car. This car better start. Oh no, sorry, yeah. Flamethrower.
Fucking raw!
Oh, okay. Right, this fucker's not getting away this time.
Shoot! For fuck's sake!
Beat him, beat him. No, fine. Yeah, there we go. Eat it. Dickhead, 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 Jeez, he's resilient, isn't he? Oh my god, look at this. What the fuck is this? Jesus. Shoot, shoot. Go on, Sean. Go on, Sean. Rifle, rifle. Go on, Sean. There we go. I have to say, this guy, he really enjoys his life. He really values his life. Jesus Christ, the resilience on this motherfucker. Arrow, arrow, there we go. Nut shot, go for nut shot. Nut shot. Nut shot, dick shot, come on. Oh, he's going for a jaw shot. Oh, jaw shot. Fucking Greg all for game looking motherfucker. Jesus. For anyone who says The Last of Us 2 focused more on the humans than the zombies, I personally think that this is another case of appropriate balance. After all, I think it's far more interesting to look at how the humans have evolved or devolved in a situation of this kind, and the things that they can and will do to one another for survival, and this balance I think is reflected quite nicely in the gameplay. Fighting humans is quite fun and definitely a different challenge to the zombies. I will say that as someone who gets scared quite easily, especially in video games, I did not appreciate the stalkers or the giant rat king. This whole section leading up to and within the hospital from Abby's point of view, I had to turn the volume down a little bit and went out for some fresh air quite often because I was going to shit myself. I guess that does mean it's effective though.
Oh my god! Fuck off! No one likes you! Leave! Leave! Oh, there's another! Shoot! Get away! Move! There.
My final and biggest issue from a technical point of view is the lack of visual diversity. The game looks so bloody depressing all the time. It's always cloudy and raining and dark, and the amount of dark corridors you walk through. It's not visually inviting at all, which is exactly what they're going for, and they've definitely succeeded in that part. But this is one of those things I think that will severely hurt the replayability factor, because I don't think many people want to revisit that world anytime soon. It drains the life and the hope out of you. This again is another topic I'll cover more in just a bit, but to summarize, I could probably count the amount of times it was sunny in the game quite easily. And from a visual standpoint alone, the game is too strenuous and depressing that a lot of times enjoyment turned into anxiety. And I get that that is the desired emotional effect, but what I'm saying is that there's too much of that. Too much darkness and not enough light. And that was a balance that the first game I think struck perfectly, and the second game not so much, which is a brilliant segue into the next point. I'm just gonna address my biggest issues with the story and characters first. It's way too long and way too depressing, and that is not a good combination. The first game was 10 hours shorter than this one, and I understand that this is telling the stories of two characters, so it obviously needs to be longer, but I'm talking about the walking around stuff, getting from point A to point B. Certain sections did not need to be as long as it was, and if you played the game, then I'm sure you'll agree with me when I say there are so many moments that could have been shortened significantly, so everything just feels a bit more streamlined. I think the creators went a bit too far and got a bit too cocky in terms of the length and the pace, making this game feel more like the equivalent of like a director's cut or an extended cut than the theatrical release of a film. And those flashbacks, although emotional and informative, it didn't really help with the pacing at all. And I really don't mind content that is longer than the industry standard. If anything, I really like it. What I don't like is unnecessary length. And I think it got to a point where I was tempted to just start reading and watching, plot points online because I just wanted to know what happened, and I started to feel like I couldn't be bothered to spend another hour and a half being told that life is terrible and everything sucks and oh look, it's another dark corridor. When the first game still had a lot of charm and heart and humor, and I think a lot of that is lost in this one, which kind of leads it to feel too cold and too hopeless at points. I started to lose the drive to do some of this stuff, like traveling to a hospital, defeating this mutated testicle just to get some medical supplies for a character who's gonna die in about an hour. And that's another thing I want to address. There's a little too much sort of left in the air, stuff that they could perhaps amend or expand upon in a third game. Where the first game was quite focused for the most part, this one is a lot more sprawling, even though most of it only takes place in about 3 days. But we meet a lot more characters and factions, and unfortunately, not all of them are done justice. The Wolves and Seraphites were quite an interesting conflict, but it was never truly explored with any real depth, I think. I'm always fascinated by these kinds of groups, and I would have loved some further deep diving, even though they kind of killed each other off towards the end. Then I think there are people like Jesse, who I kind of knew was going to die, and the way he died felt quick and sudden, but in an effective and realistic way, and I think he served his purpose to the story. But then there are characters like Isaac, who I would love to have seen more of. I remember reading somewhere that this guy was like Marlene's husband or something. Would have liked a bit more of him. Also, he's played by Jeffrey Wright, and I only found that out after finishing the game, and I was like, this guy's voice is ridiculously familiar, so there you go, Jeffrey Wright. The rest of Abby's group was like really uninteresting. Manny, I did not care for one bit. This is the one who kind of looks like Neil Druckmann. I felt nothing when he died. Mel's only thing was that she was pregnant. Otherwise, I wouldn't have felt that much sympathy for her at all. Owen was just rather generic and not nearly as likable or charismatic as I think the creators needed him to be. Ellie had a lot more interesting supporting characters, right? Dina was great. I quite like Dina, and I hope we get at least a little bit more of her if we do get a third game. Tommy was in the game just the right amount for me, and his arc was somewhat concluded, but also left open enough for future installments. Then we have to talk about Yara and Lev. Quite interesting. This was the trans stuff that clearly got muddled up with Abby during the leaks. I quite enjoyed that section, and some of the best moments I think came because of these characters, even though I felt like Lev's arc was the most underexplored and anticlimactic. I mean, he essentially gets his mum and his sister killed, and that guilt, which is obviously there, is never really shown or addressed. Now we need to talk about the big three. I was very, very sad when Joel died. One of the things that us fans of the first game were dreading was whether or not they'd kill Joel in the second one, when we were told that Ellie would be the protagonist, and obviously they did kill him off. All the moments with Joel, especially the opening song and the rocket ship, were amazing and truly emotional without being, excessively manipulative. And obviously I have to address that the way his death was handled has been described as wrong and distasteful by a number of fans. And I obviously felt very sad. I was silent for the next 15 minutes, thinking about whether Abby's death would be satisfying enough for me. But then I thought, do I think this is bad writing because it's bad? Or am I just upset that a character I like has been killed in a really mean and disrespectful way, even though it might actually have been dramatically effective. And then I realized that this is not the first time in a piece of media that I love that a man of good intentions who has had to do bad things and make enemies lets his trusting nature get the better of him and then gets brutally murdered as a result. I mean, it's not a bad comparison. We even have a badass brown-haired girl out for revenge. So I'm not saying Joel's death is masterful writing, nor am I saying it's atrocious storytelling. What I'm saying is that in the context of this particular story that they want to tell, it's an effective enough inciting incident for Ellie and Tommy to kickstart their quest. And the fact that we also got to see him in flashbacks shows that they haven't completely abandoned the character, shows that they do still have some respect for this character, and that Troy Baker and Joel will always be the heart of the series, no matter how many more installments we get. So my genuine question regarding Joel's death is, are people just upset because they're not used to main characters being killed off nonchalantly, left, right, and center? Or is it because you're genuinely convinced that it doesn't make sense for this story? If you're the former, I certainly would not watch Breaking Bad or early seasons Game of Thrones. Better people than Joel get far worse treatment. I wouldn't go near that stuff if I were you. But if you're the latter, who thinks it's genuinely terrible storytelling, I'd be very interested to hear your take and what you have to say. If you think it's out of character for him to trust, for example, or the fact that he saved Abby's life and she still killed him, these are all valid points that I would love to discuss with you. I do have to point out, however, how interesting it is that a lot of people are complaining about characters in films and TVs having plot armor and not dying when they realistically should. And then those same people are now complaining when this guy rushes carelessly into a room and gets headshotted, and that's that. I guess people are hard to please. Abby and Ellie. Yeah, this is yet another gigantic talking point that we have to break down in depth. The first thing I'll say regarding this stuff is that the time structure of the game is something I quite like. This idea of, we'll show the exact same 3 days in Seattle, but from the perspective of two different characters, Ellie first, then Abby, and we see Abby meet people that we've already killed as Ellie. I think that's really interesting. And when we see them in that storyline, sort of heightens the impact of their death. Just like this character here, even though she's like the most insignificant part of the story, but it's a nice little detail. This kind of equal structure is something I've always found interesting and kind of reminded me of The Place Beyond the Pines, a film with essentially two protagonists on different sides, and the third act kind of brings it all together nicely. But the same with The Prestige, actually. These are stories that show two different sides equally and show both the good and the bad things that they've done, and then allow you to choose which side you're on. And I don't think this game was able to do that quite as well. I will say that I do love the time jumping and seeing the same thing from different points of view idea, although I do think I have a bit of a bias towards that because I've done something kind of similar in my feature film, the one that I'm working on. There were moments when I was playing this game and I was like, oh, yeah, look at that, that's familiar. So if you do get a chance to watch my film at some point when it eventually comes out, please do remember that I wrote my script back in January, and I think I was able to do things a little bit more successfully in that department and not take it to as extreme a level as The Last of Us. Hank, why am I marketing my film here? It's not even finished anyway. I think that we all realized, right, that when we were playing as Abby, the killer of Joel, the woman who killed the first game's protagonist in an extremely brutal way, we realized that unless the game could make us sympathize with her, it would kind of fail on a character level, because they need to make us feel like we are playing as someone who isn't a full-on villain when we play as Abby, right? And I would say that after a while I did start to kind of feel sorry for Abby, all right? Because this is someone who has lost everything, and everything that she's lost has been at the hands of Joel or Tommy or Ellie. And so it's understandable that she wants revenge against these people. And of course she sort of finds something to lose when she meets Lev. And that's ultimately what compels her to fight Ellie at the end. But I think what the game is trying so hard to do is show Abby as a good person. They show that despite having lost all her friends and family, that she is willing to let Ellie go. Twice, that is, twice. She doesn't kill Ellie when she has the chance. The game shows that she's willing to defy orders to defend Owen. It shows that she is willing to help the other side when she saves Yara and Lev. That she's willing to infiltrate a hospital to get medical supplies for essentially a stranger. Time and time again, Abby is portrayed as a good person who, just like Ellie, has lost so much at the hands of violence and vengeance. And then on the other hand, they kind of show Ellie as become a bit of a villain. Someone who gets overly consumed by revenge, that she alienates those around her. The fact that she tortures people and does truly vile things in the name of revenge, I feel is like the writer's way of making Abby more likable. They keep showing her as good and they keep emphasizing Ellie has kind of turned to the dark side. And I mean, the only time in the entire game when you are forced to kill a dog, which by the way, another side note, I'm so proud to say, that was the only time I killed a dog in the entire game. Whenever things went south and dogs chased me and I got exposed, I restarted that checkpoint immediately. But yes, the only dog I killed in the game was as Ellie, right? Alice the dog, who Abby pets again and again and plays fetch with. I think they wanted to make things neutral, no real heroes, no real villains, and I like that. But what they've done is that they've made Abby seem so great at the cost of Ellie. And so I think if you've played this game without any investment in the first game, you will almost root for Abby, because for a large chunk of it, she just seems to do nice things. And Ellie just seems like a bit of a crazy maniac. And so the manipulation of the characters in the script, it's a bit unfair, right? It's a bit unfair and it feels a bit rigged, but it does work, right? But the one thing I will say, where it falls apart, I think, on almost every count, and something I don't think the writers factored in, even though it's like the most important thing, is the aftermath, the guilt, the regret. Every time Ellie does something bad, she instantly feels trauma. She questions herself and slowly realizes the toll this is taking on her and everyone around her. The fact that she gets a physical reaction of sickness when she discovers that she killed a pregnant woman shows that she isn't an evil psychopath, but is simply a human driven by anger and pain and loss and has been driven too far. And she realizes that. Abby, on the other hand, never really addresses or shows regret for any of her actions. She slowly beats Joel to death, and yet there seems to be no human remorse. She never seems to be saddened by any of her horrible actions. After she kills Joel, she mentions him once or twice, and that's that. And to stick with the Red Wedding comparison, it's like Walder Frey and Roose Bolton just kind of forgot about killing the Starks and just kind of got on with their lives, right? These guys had a whole lengthy conversation about Rob's death and his mistakes that led up to them betraying him. And obviously they take full advantage of his death in later seasons. We don't get that with Abby. She spent all this time waiting to kill Joel. And if the central theme of the game is that revenge is bad and violence is bad and we shouldn't do it, then why is that only being conveyed through Ellie's side and not Abby? Even though these two characters have been through similar tragedies, they seem to treat Abby like a victim and Ellie like a perpetrator. They're supposed to be mirrors of each other, and yet the thematic elements only seem to apply to one of them. Not only do I think that that is inconsistent, it makes the writing for the Abby character feel disingenuous. It just feels like they're trying to guilt trip us into liking her, as opposed to her genuinely earning the admiration of the players. The one character detail about her that I will say works and works well to heighten the drama is the fact that she lets Ellie go twice. I think that this is the most organic way of showing she isn't a completely detestable monster, that she is capable of mercy, and that Ellie is just as bad for trying to get her that final time, when Abby has already let things go. And I think that the conclusion to Abby's arc in this game is when she walks away in that theater, when she realizes, I still have Lev, I still have something to live for, and I'm gonna take the high ground, and show mercy once again. And I think that ultimately, one of the most important themes in the game, aside from revenge and the cycle of violence which everyone is talking about, is the idea of letting go. And I think in this moment, it's the moment where Abby lets go because she isn't alone. And I think that's why Ellie's arc works better than most people are giving it credit for, and I think it's why the ending works better than most people think. Alright? Now, one of the big complaints, obviously, from a lot of people online is that the ending sucks. It sucks because the game is about revenge, and at the end, the character doesn't even get her revenge. I've heard people say it's like if John Wick doesn't kill Yosef, or Hugh Glass doesn't kill Fitzgerald, or the bride doesn't kill Bill. People are saying that it just goes against the story and the wants and the needs of this character. Ellie has murdered her way through states worth of people, some of which are innocent, just to get to Abby. And when she gets there, she decides to show mercy? Loads of people are saying it makes no sense, and I would agree. If we're looking at it from that way, I would agree. It's stupid, and it goes against the harsh world of The Last of Us, and I absolutely see where you're coming from. I would like to, however, look at the ending from a slightly different point of view. Because for me, The Last of Us Part 2 is not a typical revenge story. If anything, I think it's an anti-revenge story. I think that if this game was told like a conventional revenge tale, like John Wick or The Revenant or Kill Bill, they wouldn't waste time showing us Abby and making us care for her. They'd just have us play as Ellie the whole time and make her kills even more satisfying, and have her show very little remorse when she finally kills Abby, and it's gonna be really satisfying, boom, done, just like that. But that's not the case. Unlike the films I mentioned, The Last of Us 2 is not showing revenge as a satisfying thing. This is not a story that says kill this person and you'll feel good at the end. It's a story that says kill this person and there's no coming back, and shows all the things that you've lost in your pursuit of vengeance. The three protagonists in those films I mentioned set out on their quest of revenge because they've lost everything. They have nothing left in their lives but the desire to get even, and only at the end do they find something that brings them back on track, whether it be a daughter or a dog. The difference here is that Ellie already has so much. She has Dina, she has Tommy, she has JJ, she has the Jackson community who welcome her with open arms, and yet she's still after this one thing that she can't let go of, and it shows the flaw in that character. So a lot of people are saying that Ellie's arc was butchered because it would have been fulfilled if she killed Abby. But I think Ellie's arc has been fulfilled because she decides to leave it be at the last minute, because she decides to let it go and to walk away, to let go of the pain of Joel's death and the knowledge of Abby's life, to see the value in what she has, not what she's lost. And ultimately, she is put in the position that Abby has been put in twice. She does what Abby at her most empathetic did, by showing mercy, and she does what Abby at her worst couldn't do, which was hold back the rage and just let it go. I think if Ellie kills this person here, this beaten down, on the verge of death individual, that she will not be able to come back from it, and she will not be satisfied. And you as the player, I don't think, will be ultimately satisfied. And she'll essentially become Abby, the Abby from the beginning of the game. So in a way, I don't see this as the bride not killing Bill. I see this as Luke Skywalker not killing Darth Vader. Now I'm aware the biggest argument to my point is that Ellie has already killed so many people. She's already ruined so many lives and taken the loved ones from so many people just to get to Abby. Why would she stop at the person she's been trying so hard to get when she's already taken things way further than they needed to have gone in the first place? My response is simply because it is Abby. Because it is her target. And the person she hates more than anything is ultimately what snaps her out of it. And the fact that she feels she could end up fully becoming and inhabiting this person that she's looking at as a result. Losing everything she has, including her memory of Joel, symbolized beautifully through her inability to play the guitar he gave her. Instead of the revenge bringing her closer to getting justice for Joel, it severs her connection to him. And only at the end does she realize the error of her ways and learns to let go. But the question is, and the ambiguity in the ending is it too late? And so in that way, I think the ending works for me personally, because I view The Last of Us Part 2 as an anti-revenge story, as opposed to the more conventional revenge tale. Overall, I would say I quite liked The Last of Us Part 2. It's not nearly as atrocious as some people have made it out to be, but I think it's also not nearly as masterful as others have said. It's a game with a number of flaws, but one that tried. One that actually wasn't just about pleasing fans and making everyone happy. This is a game that makes a number of mistakes, but at least it didn't play it safe. And I would much rather have a game be flawed and controversial, but at least be daring in its delivery and have something to say, than a good game that just kind of flies under the radar without much fanfare. Now, if any of you are wondering whether or not I would like a third game, the answer is yes. I would very much like to return to this world. I would very much like to play another Last of Us game because I really do love these characters. But what I think they should do is look at the mistakes that they've made with part 2 and sort of amend that and realize why the fans were upset and try to do better. But at the same time, to not sort of do a J.J. Abrams with Rise of Skywalker and disregard everything that came before and kind of correct things just for fan service. I think they need to stick on the path that they're going. But I think they need to go about it in a different way, and in a way that feels more compassionate, and in a way that feels less dark and depressing, and in a way that essentially is kind of a little bit more like the first game, one that balances light and dark perfectly. That's how I think they should proceed if they do decide to proceed. And they probably will, because the game's already made so much money. Love it or hate it, The Last of Us 2 will be one of the most talked about games for years to come. You know, it will spark many debates and disagreements. And even though there shouldn't really be sides, I feel like I do need to establish that I am one of the ones who holds the first game in really high regard. And I do think it's far superior to the second. But ultimately, I did like the sequel. And I admire some of what it did despite its flaws. I do think it has more pros than cons, but I'm not oblivious to its multitude of problems. And even though it's by far the most depressing and life-sucking game I've ever played, I still believe it is an experience worth having. And positive or negative, it has certainly left an impression on me, and I will not forget about it anytime soon. I don't know how it will age for me, and I don't even know if I'll still like it as much down the line, but what I can say is that it will be one of the most iconic and remembered and deeply discussed games of recent memory. And whether you think that's because of the pros or the cons, it's up to you. But I know where I stand.